Thanks, Andre, for a great session. I'm so excited to be here with all of you. Thank you so much to Jan for inviting us. I'm Nicole Krensky. I'm a director of product marketing at Bullhorn, and I'm responsible for our go-to-market strategy for our automation and AI products. So very nice to meet all of you. Happy to have you. And I'm joined today by my friend and former classmate, Chris Mannion. Chris is a founder of Sonar Talent, and he is actually going to kick us off with a little story about a problem, a solution, an opportunity, and how he got into AI. So take it away, Chris.
Thank you, Nicole. Really excited to be here and have this conversation. Been focused on AI for a number of years now, and I'm especially excited about the Q&A that we have at the end. So please drop questions in, and Nicole and I are hoping to answer those as we get further along. But I did want to start by just giving a bit of context on my background. See, I didn't come from a recruiting or a HR background. Initially, I actually started my career in aerospace engineering in the military. Really two parts to that. One was counter-piracy, counter-terrorism work out in the Middle East, which I guess the closest thing you could relate to recruiting is trying to find a needle in the haystack, trying to find pirates at sea in large swaths of ocean. So not quite the same, but similar concept. But more related to this conversation, I did spend the last couple of years researching the use of unmanned systems, unmanned aircraft and weapons for the next several decades for the military. And that taught me a lot about AI, machine learning, and how to apply that into a space in which the consequences of highly negative impacts are pretty large, but also in a space where we actually want to start to encourage people to interact more with systems. And this was 15 years ago, so well before a lot of what we're seeing right now with generative AI. But my career moved into supply chain analytics through business school, where Nicole and I met, worked at Amazon for a little bit, actually started a company doing maritime shipping analytics, trying to bring more machine learning to avoid large congestion of maritime shipping routes. But found my way to Wayfair, actually building a supply chain analytics team to try and solve some of the problems of shipping large furniture in 1 or 2 days. That was very exciting, but in 2018, I found I had this huge problem where I actually couldn't build my team. We couldn't hire enough people of the right quality, and I'm sure that many of you who've been in recruiting for a while will recognize that this has happened really over the last decade. It got much more complicated. And an opportunity came up to move into recruiting and actually lead our early career hiring team. I thought, how hard could it be? This must be a pretty easy solve coming out of business school with an operations background. I'll go there for 6 months. I'll fix recruiting. I'll go back to the business. How wrong I was, and I've spent the last almost 6 years now in the recruiting space. Eventually moving on to start my own company, actually leaving to solve some of the big problems that I found. And we're really trying to bring AI and machine learning into the recruiting and staffing space to try and tackle some of the big problems that can't be solved with some of the more basic things that we're actually going to cover today as well. But kind of going back to my time at Wayfair, I wanted to kind of walk through my own experience of actually going through this step-by-step process of trying to solve one of the big problems that we had. And I'm sure that many of you have seen this, but the task I was given to actually build a team to solve was that we had this problem where over the last 5 years, we'd increased our spending on recruiting. So that meant increasing the number of recruiters, increasing the spend on recruiting tools, different TA tech stack purchases, implementing machine learning and AI and all these different kind of processes that we felt like would improve the recruiting performance from time to hire, cost per hire, quality of hire, and then really the hires per headcount, which was one of our main drivers. But what we actually saw is the more tools we implemented, that actually the worse the whole recruiting org performed. So we saw hires per recruiter go down over time. And my manager, the head of TA, who asked me to build up this team, presented me this problem and said, hey, let's figure out what's going on, and your task is to try and fix it. So knowing very little about recruiting at that time, I started with what I knew from ops, which was, gee, how do we pinpoint the source of what's causing this problem? So we started with the basic operations time study, like actually how are recruiters currently spending their time? What can we learn from that? So we had all our data, but I wanted to understand what a day-to-day job of a recruiter looks like. What I found is that the actual recruiting part of the day-to-day job, the contacting candidates, scheduling interviews, screening, working with hiring managers, actually only accounted for about a third of the total time. And that had gone down over time as we implemented more tools. There was a bigger requirement for training. There was more expectations for reporting and analytics. And the recruiters really just wanted to recruit. So we found that we'd added all of these different steps and processes to the recruiter's job. And now we needed to figure out how do we actually get recruiters to spend more time recruiting. So bringing, again, some ops theory into the recruiting space, I started to look at the kind of lean principles, really bringing a lot from, if you've heard of the Toyota production system, where you essentially look at everything that is currently taking place and try and remove waste as the first step. So started initially by, we're going to talk through the steps that we recommend in a moment, but really analyzing the data, cleaning up the data that we had, analyzing and figuring out where was the activity that we were doing that was actually low value, and how could we remove that. So we started just by taking all non-recruiting activity within reason off recruiters' plate. And then once we'd figured out that we had a kind of like a more efficient process, we then started to look at how can we redesign this process. We had over 400 recruiters across the organization, and with 400 recruiters, we had about 400 different ways of recruiting. So because we actually had the data and a cleaner process at that point, what we could then do is see, well, which processes work best for executive recruiting, for volume hiring, for kind of mid-level business, for technical hiring, and then start to build these efficient paths and implement them into applicant tracking systems so that we could actually have everyone work through the optimum path based on the type of roles they were hiring for. And so we'd implemented that, and it was only then that we started to look at what else can we do in order to now build or buy solutions to solve some of the problems that we had left, knowing that we'd actually solved most of the problems that we could. And that actually led us to save a whole ton of money in our overall spend, but actually increase spend in the areas in which we knew that we were going to get a positive return on investment. And this kind of brings us to the use case of AI, where we're actually now thinking about how do you empower the recruiter to be more effective. So I think one of the big fears that we see in AI is, well, AI is going to come and take all of our jobs. And I think I gave you the background from my military experience to kind of reference this point. Because recruiting is a people industry, actually, you really want that person-to-person interaction. So the focus with the tools, with implementing AI and machine learning, is not to replace the recruiter, but actually to empower them to be more effective. This concept of the 10x recruiter that's actually really going to improve the overall performance of the organization, but actually make that person able to do more work. I see it as very similar to aviation, where my background is. You wouldn't jump onto an airplane that didn't have a pilot, but we have more and more systems to make the pilot able to operate more safely and more effectively over time. And brings me back to kind of the final quote from my military background is, we think about how do you equip the person and not man the equipment. And I think that's a really important thing to think about moving forward as we start to discuss different tools and technologies. So it was a bit of a monologue from my part, but just to give you a baseline of my background, I'm going to hand back to Nicole, who's going to talk a little bit about the next stage.
Thanks, Chris. All right, so next up, let's actually talk about AI and staffing. What are we talking about, and how far behind is everybody or not? So I'm going to go through the categories of staffing AI. So this is how Bullhorn is thinking about AI and how it's going to impact staffing, and how we're really looking at investing in technology that's going to be really impactful in these areas. So first up is generative AI. This is what all the hype has been about, right? I'm sure all of you know what generative AI is. We're talking ChatGPT. This is the tech that intelligently generates text, visuals, other content. And there are a number of use cases that we see for this. So this, in terms of what Bullhorn is doing, is actually the first AI category that we are investing heavily in. And this is going to be launching in March. So feel free to find out more by checking us out on our website there. When we think about the other two categories, so there's source and match. So source and match is automating the process of identifying the best candidates for a job or the best jobs for particular candidates. We see a lot of value here as well, and this is where data really comes into play. And finally, directive AI. This is the third category. This is all about identifying areas of opportunity for users and driving behaviors that will optimize the recruiting process, lead to better outcomes. All of these are important, but they're all a little bit different. For the purposes of today, we're going to talk a little bit more about generative AI because that is what most people are super jazzed about. So if you think about why is there so much hype, like what's different about this versus anything else? Well, the reason generative AI has so much interest is it's the first form of AI that's really easy to understand and interpret value from. It's not just a conversation for people with technical backgrounds anymore or technical knowledge. It's really all about access. In native language, in English or any language that you speak, you can ask questions and you can pull value and insights from data that previously would have required a data analyst to do. So essentially what generative AI is doing, if you have the right data in place, is making every recruiter a data analyst. So it's really all about that access and being able to pull things out of the data that you already have. And then just for some context, so it took Netflix about 10 years to move from 1 million users to 100 million users. And it's taken ChatGPT 120 days. So, obviously there have been some other technological advances in that time, but it is a very big deal. And these are a few stats from our 2023 AI survey of Bullhorn customers. So, what are we looking at here? What are they saying? 52% are planning to roll out AI-driven solutions in the next year. So almost half of you are already thinking about what you're going to be putting out there. More than half of you are already experimenting with generative AI. And then if you look at the 78%, this is what I find the most interesting, especially as we're thinking about the hype around AI. Almost 80% mostly want to know what everybody else is doing. So to me, this suggests nobody has quite figured this out yet, and there's still a lot up for interpretation, and there's still a lot of unknowns, but the enthusiasm is definitely there. So this is the Gartner hype cycle for AI. So if you look at this, probably some of you are familiar with the Gartner hype cycles, but generative AI is highlighted there at the top. We are right at the peak of inflated expectations for Gen AI. And so the way to read this is like by the color coding. So Gartner's estimating that generative AI is going to reach the plateau of productivity, right? Meaning it's going to be in our everyday work. It's going to be everywhere you see. People will know how to use it. It's not really evolving or changing at the same rate in about 5 to 10 years. That's still a long way away. So I just want to make this point that if you are feeling a little bit panicked or you are feeling like you're behind, remember 78% of people want to know what you're doing because they're curious about what everybody else is doing. And also real experts in the industry are saying you've still got time. Right now, the hype is there, but the value is not. So now Chris and I want to spend the bulk of our time talking about how you actually design an effective AI strategy. So what steps can you take now to avoid missteps later? So here's what we put together for you. One thing I want to call out is you should not start by just using the technology. That's step 5. That's at the end of the series of steps that you should take to really prepare yourself and make sure that when you do start using the tech and when you do implement it, number 1, it will actually be adopted by the people working in your business. And number 2, you'll actually get the value out of it because you have taken the time to set up everything ahead of time. So Chris and I will go through each of these step by step and talk about them. So I will hand it over to Chris to talk about mapping out your current process.
Great, thanks, Nicole. And I just want to call out, as we were planning how to actually structure these 5 steps, what we started actually with was the unhappy path. One of my experiences of actually first going into the TA ops space and trying to understand our whole stack. One of the experiences that I'd seen is that we had actually implemented a chatbot on our job board. And so the idea of this was great. It was a way for candidates to be able to get their questions answered, to actually get recommendations for which jobs would be potentially suitable for them. And it was implemented pretty effectively at a relatively small cost. And so this was jumping straight to step 5. What we hadn't done are these other 4 steps that we are going to talk through. And so actually, as candidates were using the chatbot, there was actually no interaction between the recommendations that were being made and actually the back-end infrastructure of the actual jobs that we were prioritizing, the kind of paths into the ATS and into recruiters' pipelines. So no one was really being prioritized, even if we were pre-qualifying them on the front end. And so we just wanted to start with a kind of like, what happens when you don't do this right? And we had a terrible candidate experience, which you saw it decrease, and that affected everything in the kind of recruiting pipeline. But having gone through the whole process again to actually get to success, we're actually going to talk through these 5 steps. Now, I've seen this both as a buyer in my previous job, but also as a vendor now, working with several companies just to see how they can potentially implement something that would be more effective. And so we actually start with, I think, how I outlined my own experience, which was mapping out the current process. So I think before you think about the type of tool that you're interested in experimenting with, I think you really have to understand how your current process is working. So it kind of goes back to even the time study that I'd recommended earlier. What proportion of the day are your recruiters actually spend doing different aspects of their job? And then how does that track to your expectations? Are they spending more time sourcing, trying to find candidates? Are they spending more time actually scheduling different interviews? What are the kind of the value adds of each step? Like, are they spending an effective amount of time pre-screening candidates, which is then reducing your increasing your pass-through rate further down the funnel and actually saving a lot of time where the interviewing process gets more expensive? Or are people kind of rushing through that because they have different metrics to hit? So we're kind of starting with a non-tech solution of really just mapping that end-to-end process and understanding each of the stages throughout. Once you get that and actually get that qualitative feedback from your recruiters and from actually visualizing how the process currently looks, then you can start to understand what are the big pain points that we're currently seeing, how important are each of those. And the idea is to come out of this stage with a list of all the different areas in which you believe you're currently underperforming, with kind of evidence to support that. So, my recruiters are spending a lot of their time actually preparing reports for clients, and we want a way to improve that, which could be as simple as replacing kind of manual reporting with templates, which many of you probably already do, or you could use some kind of generative AI solution. But we don't want to jump to that immediately. We're actually going to work through each step in the process to actually get to that point where we know when we implement something, it's going to be the most effective solution for that problem. And we're actually going to be able to measure the improvement to see if it actually has improved, and we're actually spending our kind of limited budget most effectively. And so I'd say this is the kind of like first step in the process. Understand what you're currently doing, and then figure out where the pain points are going to be kind of moving forward. And then we move into step 2, where I think Nicole and I are going to play ping pong here and pass back and forth.
Yeah, thanks, Chris. All right, so step 2, clean and centralize your data. This is arguably the most important step. As we said earlier, the cleaner your data, the better quality your data has, the better the outputs for AI are going to be. The quality of data is just so crucial to the effectiveness of AI systems. If you're using data that's inaccurate or incomplete or inconsistent or biased, then the predictions and decisions that come out of the model are also going to be inaccurate, incomplete, inconsistent, biased. So high quality data results in AI really being able to make more accurate predictions, provide the most relevant recommendations, and automate the processes that you're trying to automate a lot more effectively. So maintaining data quality is really, really crucial. Some of the common pitfalls that firms might see with data are just, what we've talked about: inconsistency, inaccuracy, incompleteness. Sometimes if there's poor data governance, and you're not going to be able to pull the information you're looking for because it's not in the right place, it's not in the right format. When information is outdated or irrelevant, I think that we see this sometimes. If you go to ChatGPT, that was trained a couple of years ago on a specific subset of data. So if you start asking it questions about data or information that's outdated, you're not going to get the right answers, right? We also see a lot of issues with data standardization and security. This is a really huge point about security. We want to make sure that we're being safe, that we're being responsible with how we use AI, but I really can't say enough times, data is key. It's the key to everything. So if you skip this step, or if you don't make that effort, to clean and centralize data, have everything that you want input into the AI available in the same place and accessible, you are never going to make the types of gains and the types of efficiencies that you want from AI. It's not going to be as successful. You'll have issues with adoption. This is really just the most important part. There are tons of resources out there to help you figure out, okay, where is all my data right now? Where can I set it up? And how do I move it forward? And this is something that you should really look for when you're thinking about partners, which we'll get to in a little bit, is somebody who understands how important this is and who is willing to help figure this part out of the process. So data, I mean, people say cash is king, but when it comes to AI, data is king. Off to you, Chris.
Great. And so by this point, you really understand your current process. You have all of your data mapped to that process. It's all clean. It's easy to actually push into a model. So when you actually get the recommendations and the guidance from the model or the system, you know they're actually going to be rooted in reality and not necessarily in some assumptions that the vendor will have had to make. I think the next stage is to actually understand what are the different types of AI applications or tools or automation that I could consider now that I know how I'm currently performing, how my current process is mapped, and where my shortfalls are measured by actual metrics. We can then start to look at different ways to solve it. I think before we jump to potential partners, though, we actually want to understand the types of AI and the use cases that they may have. And so there's kind of a whole context of artificial intelligence is a very broad field. Within that, we have machine learning and then neural networks and then generative AI, which is a subset of kind of everything. But that's the one that I think we're most excited about and we're going to talk through today. And so when you start to think about generative AI, it's important to understand where the model is trained, which is currently on kind of historic data that model has access to. And if you're only using the kind of prior data that model has been trained on, you're actually not going to implement all of the really good, clean, important proprietary data that you have access to. And so it's important to understand how you could potentially blend the two concepts together and actually come up with a solution that is more relevant for what you're looking for. And we've given a couple of recommendations here of kind of different use cases of applied large language models into conversational chatbots, which is what I think most people have been familiar with over the last 6 months with ChatGPT, Bard, and then Llama from Meta, where they can actually predict the answer that you were looking for based on the context of the input that you give. But I think one thing to bear in mind is once you understand the type of AI that you're potentially going to be using, is to then understand how do you actually want to leverage that AI and what are the different kind of policy requirements that you want to put in place. And we're given a couple here, the kind of security, privacy, and compliance part of things. It's important to understand how different vendors could potentially use your data. If you look at the OpenAI privacy policy, you'll see that with a personal account, they'll actually use your data to train on unless you opt out. So by default, any data you give to it is actually being used to train the model. If you look at the enterprise accounts, then by default, they don't use your data to train their models. And so your data is never shared with anyone outside of a couple of users within OpenAI, which is why it's so important to actually understand important to actually lay out clear policy guidelines to determine whether you are going to allow employees and recruiters to use their own kind of personal accounts, or whether you're actually going to have something on the corporate side that is going to give you more protection when you're sharing potentially sensitive data. It's important to have accountability and transparency. Do you have an internal person who's going to be accountable for ensuring that that the use of AI is in line with your values and your mission statement? Are you actually going to be able to transparently talk about the way that your recruiting process uses AI and how that's actually going to mitigate bias? We've seen with increased regulation in California and New York and potentially federal regulation, the use of AI is actually going to be increasingly used in potential lawsuits. So you have to understand how different systems are using AI and how that could potentially impact decision making throughout the recruiting process. And so if you're not prepared to be accountable for that right now, I'd say that's one of the steps to get in place before you start considering different vendors. And then potentially the most exciting part is next looking at the different vendors. I'm going to hand back to Nicole to talk through that.
Thanks, Chris. All right, so choosing the right partners. This is obviously a big deal. Most staffing firms out there are not equipped to build their own LLMs and are going to be relying on outside expertise, improving models. So I wanted to walk through just what you should be thinking about as you are considering what partners to work with and who you want to help support your AI goals and your visions. So the first most important thing is think about what use cases you're most interested in. Do you want to do the things that are in the generative AI bucket, like the content creation, summarization, improving communications, formatting resumes, or are you more interested in source and match, finding the best talent and jobs? Or are you more interested in directive, how do I change my process based on data to make these decisions and know exactly what step comes next to lead to the best result? Or are you interested in all three? So all of those things matter. Vendors and partners out there are exploring all three. Some just one or the other. Some are more targeted, and others like Bullhorn are doing all of them. So you really want to ask questions about vendor and partner AI strategies. What are they thinking about? What are their goals? What are their short-term goals, but also long-term goals? How much input can you have as a partner in how they develop that process? So there are a lot of great questions there that you should be asking, and don't be afraid to be picky. A lot of people are doing this. It is a really, really exciting time, and I think it's really all about finding the best fit. So in terms of how we see the AI landscape and available partners, so you have the generic providers, Google, Microsoft, OpenAI. These are some examples of them, but this is like the large language models. These are the companies that are providing frameworks for custom models. They're providing the infrastructure in the background for supporting generative AI. And then on the other end of the spectrum, you've got customer marketplace solutions. So these are smaller partners. These are vendors who are out there coming up with some very niche solutions, or this might even be what you develop in-house if you're a larger company or you have the technical expertise to do that. You are trying to solve very specialized problems. You're looking for something very, very specific or using a very specific set of data. And then in the middle, and I think this is applicable to staffing especially, we are looking at domain experts. So that's a category Bullhorn falls into. And I think outside of staffing, other companies also fall into this bucket. So if you think about what expertise, let's say Microsoft brings to the table, they know all about large language models. They know how generative AI works. They are building it in the background. They're training their models. They're providing enterprises with a closed model or a static model that's not learning, but they don't have staffing expertise. And that, if you think back to what we've been saying a bunch, data is key, right? And so you need staffing data in order to train a model to make the best decisions for staffing outcomes. And so what you want to look for here is, where can we find the best staffing data? Where can we find outcomes data? Who can we rely on for some curated staffing specific prompt engineering, some of those background things. So the way we do it at Bullhorn, we have a bring your own LLM model. So you sign on with whatever LLM provider you feel most comfortable with. You can figure out all of those security and responsible AI needs that you have and what's important to you with them. And then that gets plugged into our system. So we are having whatever LLM you choose help partner with us to actually make the generative AI come out. So instead of going into, for example, ChatGPT and typing in, please summarize the following, and then copy and pasting something into that, and then hoping that it's going to pull out the types of things you need, you can trust a partner like Bullhorn to do some of that work for you. It's directly embedded where you are, where you're working, and in the background, some of that prompt engineering is happening. So when you say, summarize Nicole Krensky, what the background is doing is saying, summarize Nicole Krensky, product marketing director at Bullhorn, with an eye towards this particular job that I'm interested in for her, using data from her resume, from past conversations, from all of these other sources. And oh, by the way, also keep in mind, is she the good fit or not? Because we have the outcomes data. And so we're going to say, is she similar to candidates that we've placed in positions like this in the past, et cetera. So this is where that data really comes into play. And I really, really hope that whether it's Bullhorn or anybody else, that you remember this point, that data is really important. You want to work with partners who prioritize it as much as you do. And so a few other things to look for. So industry experience, proven capabilities. Microsoft, OpenAI, Google, they all have the experience in the AI, but you all will need somebody who has experience in staffing. A commitment to customization. Generative AI is possibly the most customizable type of technology we've had in a while, right? You're literally talking to the tech in a way that makes sense to you, and it's responding, hopefully, in a way that makes sense to you and giving you the outcome that you want. As Chris mentioned earlier, when you're thinking about security and privacy and all of those things, you want to make sure that there's alignment there, not only with your values when it comes to trust, but also alignment with your long-term goals and what you're hoping to accomplish. And I think for something like this, where the world feels like it's changing very fast and technology feels like it's going to have a really big impact, and we're all not quite sure exactly what that's going to look like, trust is really, really important. Trust is important from security, but also from a partnership perspective. You want somebody who is going to help you move forward and who is sort of in it with you, who is extending a hand to invite you to be part of the process and part of the development. So choose the right partners. It's really important. And we are pretty much all in that space now, right? Remember, so many people want to know what other people are doing. Part of that is figuring out who the partners are that we're going to work with. So next up, the fun part is to actually start using the tech. So now you have your whole system in place, and it is time to actually start using it. What you're seeing on the screen here is a screenshot from Copilot, which is Bullhorn's generative AI offering. This just gives you a little sample of how it looks. But what's most important, I think, when you start using it is two things. One is adoption, and the other is collaboration and learning. So if you want to increase adoption of AI tools in the organization, there's a few things you need to do. We've heard from a lot of our early access customers that this is a really tricky point and something they were not expecting. I think they often thought, okay, we'll embed AI into recruiter workflows and they're going to be so excited. All the recruiters are going to use this every time. It's going to be such a time saver. Like, this is going to be so great. We're not going to have to convince anybody. But you know what? Humans are creature of habit. We do have to convince people. And there's also a learning process here. We don't have this quite figured out all the way yet. We're working on it, but we really rely on customer feedback as well. So if a recruiter goes in and isn't really sure what to press, like they might not just use it. They might just do things the way they always have because it's comfortable. They know what they're doing. But that's not what this period of time is about. Especially when you're testing something out, it's really about using it and making sure that you are getting information from it that will help you understand what are the use cases, what feedback do we need to give back to Bullhorn so that they can improve the product, what kind of goals do we have? We have to set a clear direction to make sure that we actually know what we're trying to accomplish and we can measure success that way. And finally, collaboration is really, really important. I can't tell you how many conversations I've had with some of our early access Copilot customers where I ask them, okay, and have you all been talking about what you're trying and different ways? And they're like, oh no, that's so important. We're only going to learn from each other. This is a collaborative environment. This is incredibly important to make sure that Bullhorn can also update the tech to make sure that it's working, that it is pulling the outcomes that we want. You know, we're all in this together. So that piece to me anyway is very, very important. Chris, is there anything you want to add before we move into key takeaways?
I'd say the only thing that I found to be very helpful in implementing new technology is to think about it as like a science-based implementation. So come up with a hypothesis. Say, you know, in this example, we see that the candidate response rates are lower than we would expect, and so we think that's a bottleneck in our recruiting process. Therefore, let's try Copilot as a way to improve response rates using generative AI, and then have a test group and a control group to actually test over a period of several weeks whether that's actually making a positive impact. If it is, you then have the data, you have the internal champions to then say, okay, this is working. Let's actually get everyone onto this process because we know it's working effectively. And that just increases buy-in. It takes a little bit longer to get going. I think you normally want to just implement something and get going straight away. But that kind of staged approach just takes a couple of weeks. but can actually have a much stronger long-term impact that I've seen through various different implementations over time.
Yeah, thanks. All right, so to summarize, a few key takeaways for you to go out into the world and set and execute your very successful AI strategies. So first, we'll say it again, data quality is critical. The better your data, the more value you'll get from using AI. It's just so important. Input is everything. Second, take the time to learn. Chris walked through sort of his process of jumping straight into trying to fix something, but not taking the time right away to understand, what are the actual problems and needs. But also take the time to learn about what AI really is. What's an LLM? How do they connect into staffing technology? What's happening to the data in the background? The more you know and the more you can understand, the smarter decision making you can have for figuring out your own AI strategy. Third, be thoughtful about security, be smart about choosing your partners. This is collaborative. You want to make sure that you have the people on board with you who are the right people who are going to help you reach your goals. And finally, ending with the best thing you can do right now is experiment. So do steps one through 4. And then when you're ready with that, start experimenting, talk to each other, talk to your colleagues, talk to other people in the industry, share best practices, share what you're learning. That is how we are all going to get better at this together. And now we have 6 minutes left. So we would love to take a few questions. I see some in the chat. If you want to maybe put them in the Q&A, that would be great. I see one from Jill Grant. Is this feature available on all versions of Bullhorn? We have not yet finalized the packaging, so stay tuned. But we're going to be announcing more detail on what it's going to look like in mid-March. And let's see, Leanne, I see your question that it's not rolled out on Bullhorn yet. News of when it will be rolled out is, again, mid-March, so available probably April 1st, but we'll have a big announcement coming out in the middle of March. Any other questions you want to put in there, either one specific to me or one specific to Chris? While we're waiting, I see a note from Zach that AI emails read as AI emails, and there's a balance between having a personal touch and quantity. I totally agree. Chris, is there anything you want to say on that point?
Yeah, I think Danielle just actually made a comment quoting Gary Vee. I think AI is a really good starting point. It's a good way to generate a quick draft of something, but I think you are going to have to make some kind of personal adjustments, and it's trained on generic text, and so the email is going to look generic. If you actually want to improve it, you have to think of some way to get your own voice and your own thoughts in there. One way is prompt engineering. I actually have a video on YouTube on covering how to think about prompt engineering as a recruiter, but really it's thinking through how do you kind of like edit the text to give you the voice. So you can get 80% of the way there with AI, and it is going to cut down the amount of time that you have to spend. The other 20%, I think, is the personal touch, and that's going to really increase performance and response rates over the generic settings. I'd say actually on the other side as well, I've sat in interviews where candidates have used AI to generate answers if they're doing a final round presentation for like a product role or something like that, and it really sticks out like a thumb if they've used it, especially if you see 5 candidates and everyone gives you the same answer because they use the same prompts to answer the same question. So
yeah. Any other questions, comments? Okay, back to the slide earlier. What are your biggest gain points? I enjoyed your presentation. Thank you, Leo. Which slide? Okay, while I'm waiting for a follow-up from Leo, I see a question from Zach. Any other AI tools in the marketplace that you recommend outside of ChatGPT and Bullhorn? I think that there are a lot out there. In terms of the LLM, that's probably the biggest decision people have to make. Most of our customers have been using Microsoft, but we at Bullhorn anyway are committed to working with any LLM that you bring. So I think it's really a personal question. It's who do you feel most comfortable with? Who do you maybe already have a relationship with? But that would be my advice for figuring that out. And then the steps slide. Let's go back to that.
think it was step one, map out your current process.
Here we go.
Yeah, so we said one of the points was, what are your biggest pain points? I say the gain points. If we can think about like where could you potentially gain the most effectiveness, I think is maybe the kind of root of the question. It's I think understanding where you're falling short right now and where you need to improve over time. So I think with AI, one of the things that we were definitely looking at is hires per recruiter, and because we could measure that very easily, and that was the kind of big gain point that we wanted to make. But I think maybe kind of reading between the lines, the thing that AI can't do is potentially that kind of personalization, what we just discussed with the email. If you automate too much of the process, then you're taking the same approach that everyone else in the market is taking. So it's actually how can you use AI as the baseline and then like add that personal touch on top, going back to not trying to replace recruiters, but make recruiters more effective, and knowing where you can apply your best kind of skills in order to improve the outcomes is going to be, I think, critical. But you have to know how the process currently works in order to do that.
Great. All right. I apologize if I miss any. I don't see any other questions here for me and Chris to answer, but I really appreciate everybody's time. It was great to share all this with all of you. Please feel free to reach out to myself or to Chris on LinkedIn. We're always happy to chat AI and staffing recruiting, and enjoy the rest of World Staffing Summit. Thanks, everybody.